dozen prescription drugs. I lost friends, debilitating lasting pain. I got here because I gave up on the medical community. I think it's really hard for people to understand what it's like to have debilitating lasting pain. It's hard to describe. If somebody comes at you from the direction where your pain is, you tend to shudder. I find myself putting myself in actual corners to create physical barriers from people actually just bumping into me. Pain that stops who you are as a person, pain that stops you from being able to be a contributing member of society. I lost friends and family. I started at their pain clinic. I've seen a few neurologists. I did a surgical consult because at one point they were thinking about amputating my arm, which would have had absolutely no impact. I would have just lost my arm. I have seen over a dozen doctors. Every single interaction that you have with any doctor whatsoever or any part of the medical system, you're responsible for here. And it still costs us tens of thousands of dollars. And this is 10 years. We tried everything. At my height, I was on 24 prescription drugs. I found repeatedly with every single doc, they were more than willing to get me on prescriptions. They were never willing to give me directions on how to safely come off of them. They didn't know what to do with me. I learned to cope. So what you're seeing now is more people are actually choosing to commit suicide because they can't have access to drugs that they've learned to depend upon based on their medical recommendations. Without cannabis, I wouldn't be here. It helped me get off. This is going to sound awful, but on my worst days, I go into my group and I read stories of people who are suffering more than I am. I can take care of myself. I can take care of my family. I'm even going back to work. But I did not get here because of the medical community. I got here because I gave up on the medical community and realized that I had to figure out a way to cope or I was just done with.
So that's the actual conversation that we had with Carrie, who for the last 10 years has been desperately searching for new treatments, alternative options, and would have tried absolutely anything. Simultaneously, for the last 2 years, a clinical trial for her specific condition has been open and has been failing to find enough patients to join it. This is a trial that Carrie had never heard of, had never been offered by any of the dozens of doctors that she'd seen, and so to all extent and purposes might as well not exist. And it's a sad, sad story, and you kind of think, well, surely that's a one-off. That can't happen all the time, right? But actually, when you look at the data, it's phenomenal. So this year, there's going to be just over 300,000 clinical trials. Of these, 50% of them will be delayed because they can't recruit enough patients. 18% of those research sites won't even recruit one patient. That's doctors, surgeries, clinics, hospitals that have gone through processes, has gone through protocols, has been invested in order to get them ready for the trial, and not one patient will be able to join. So the cost of all this failure is extortionate. $40 billion every year. $40 billion every year just walks out the door. And that is against a backdrop of healthcare systems crumbling because they haven't got adequate funding, of pharma companies consolidating because they're trying to get over the end of the blockbuster era. And yet every year, $40 billion is just wasted down the drain. And part of the reason that this is such a problem is because of the quick rise in the number of trials that are taking place. So over the last 20 years, there's been a 13,000% increase in the number of clinical trials that occur. So what is a $40 billion problem today, 20 years ago was only a $3 million problem. So slowly and silently, this has become one of the biggest complex issues there is in the healthcare system. And what's worse is that this is something that's continuing to escalate. So the cost per trial is also on the increase. And that's partly because the cost of finding more complex and niche subpopulations is increasing, and also because of the fierce competition between pharma companies for every single patient. And of course, at the end of all of this is people like Carrie, people who are desperate to get on clinical trials, but for some reason, there's that huge disconnect between them and the trials that they're actually trying to join.
I think it's pretty clear from what we've looked at so far that business as usual really isn't good enough. And we need to take some drastic action if we're going to change things to fix some of these problems. So what's the big solution to these pretty big problems? A lot of companies are focusing quite heavily in terms of technology, looking at whether it's artificial intelligence to aid drug discovery, or looking at big data to identify new patients. And although these contribute some solutions, we're not sure they're going to solve that entire pipeline and the kind of patient experience throughout. We actually look for the kind of average journey for a patient to get onto a study. There's kind of gaps and there's problems at every stage. First, we need patients to be aware that studies even exist. And if we look at Carrie's scenario, through that 10-year journey and everyone she saw, she didn't even know trials were an option. Then when someone knows a trial is an option, they need to be directed to the right trial for them. They need to be able to find out how to actually get onto that study and go through that process. Then they have to consent, and this is often a kind of hugely complicated process that includes loads of complex legal and medical information that someone has to sign to take part into a study. And then finally, when they're actually on it, we need to keep them on it. We need to keep them engaged, often for years at a time. And we're not sure that technology is the solution to all of these problems. Sure, it kind of brings some solutions to some of the pieces, but looking at this experience for patients end to end, there's a lot of things that we can do. For us, it's a much more human problem. I think technology and artificial intelligence takes us somewhere, but understanding the human behind these journeys and understanding the human solutions to some of these problems is where we're looking, and I think where we've explored quite a lot within this white paper. Havas does a piece of research each year called the Meaningful Brand Study. Look at about 1,800 companies around the world, assess them on a number of factors, looking at the way they communicate to people, the way they communicate outside of their products, and the way that they kind of generate meaning around what they stand for. These companies are shown year on year to outperform the stock market as a whole. And this year's study shows there's about 134% difference between the companies that ranked highly in the Meaningful Brands study and the average FTSE 100 company. But if you look at healthcare, when it stacks up against the other sectors, sitting down in 11 with some pretty boring sectors in terms of finance and insurance, which is pretty terrible if you think how meaningful the work we actually do and the work that our clients does. There's so much more we should be communicating about the great things that we're able to offer to patients. And it's really not getting out there and kind of resonating with the people that have a chance. So the premise really that we looked at for the white paper is, can we bring across some of the learnings and some of the approaches that these meaningful brands take and apply it to a person's experience in a clinical study? And the white paper really looks at this patient's journey from end to end, looking at, are there opportunities to bring across a lot of the thinking and a lot of the tools that consumer brands use and apply them to plug some of these gaps in the patient journey? If you actually think about it, consumer brands are adept at managing a lot of these problems. They know how to bring new products to people that have never heard of them. They know how to help people understand and compare a new product and to complete a purchase. They know how to communicate complex legal or technical information in a way that makes sense or entertains people. And they also know how to manage customer service and to keep people engaged with a brand over the long term. So there's a lot of things that consumer brands do really well that we really need to tackle in patient recruitment. So we're now going to walk through and kind of delve into some of the challenges in these areas in a little more detail, talk about some of the potential solutions that consumer brands already have that we could look at applying. And we've looked at a few outliers, companies that are already applying solutions in the healthcare space. So the first area we touched on is awareness. It's a simple first step. In Carrie's situation, she didn't know trials existed. And actually, Harris Interactive did some research looking around the world at patients, and they found that 85% of patients across a number of therapy areas weren't even aware that trials were an option. When they spoke to the same people, 75% of them said if they knew trials were a genuine option for them, they'd consider a clinical study. So there isn't necessarily this kind of adverse perception to clinical trials as a whole. People aren't necessarily turning it down, they're just not necessarily aware it's an option. If we go back to a quote from Carrie, she literally would have done anything. She would have considered anything. She was on 10 or more individual medications. She even at one point was considering having her arm amputated, which would have done nothing. So she really would have, if she was aware that there was an option for a study, taken that option. And most pharmaceutical companies, they're finding patients through research sites. They're not really going direct to patients. And actually, as we saw in the statistics, many of the research sites aren't finding a patient at all. Some pharma companies are starting to advertise direct to patients, But this is unfortunately an example of kind of the way that it's communicated. And if you can kind of, for a minute, kind of ignore the crimes against design and typography and photography, the theme that really stands out in a lot of this advertising is that it's really all about what the pharma company wants and really nothing to do with what the patient benefit is. It's talking about the condition we want people to have. It's talking about the age we want them to be. It's talking about the location we want them to be. It's like maybe the medication they may have taken before. But none of it's talking about why trials are a benefit, why a patient might want to take part, helping take them on a journey for understanding what's this new clinical trial area that they've never heard of and why should they be part of it. If you take that same example and applied it to a big consumer brand, kind of helps illustrate how laughable this approach is. We often do this with clients, and if you imagine Nike and their kind of advertising was, are you 18 to 45 and a human? Do you have feet? Our shoes may fit you. Sounds kind of amusing, but that's actually the type of advertising that we're using to communicate with patients. And we're not selling shoes, we're selling the most complex products and services in the whole world that mean so much to the people they're for. If we look at a more relevant consumer example, many of you may be familiar with Monzo. This is one of the UK's fastest growing banks. And they've actually taken the method of kind of scarcity and exclusivity and turned something pretty boring, which is banking, and made it something everyone wants to be part of. Google have done a similar approach with their healthcare business, Verily. They've launched a clinical study called Project Baseline, and they've made it all about taking part in this kind of exclusive study. They've got a bespoke study watch that was created by Google. They've got a number of kind of exclusive branded merchandise. They've made it much more about taking part in this kind of exclusive club than it is about the data and the study and what it's trying to achieve.
So then the next stage is trial design, so the actual architecture of the study. And when you look at this through a more human lens, there's so many glaring errors that jump out at you. So this is the gold standard for how a clinical trial is designed, right? So a pharma company comes up with a new molecule, they start a clinical trial, 50% of the patients will get the drug, 50% of the patients won't get the drug, a certain amount of time goes on, and then you test and see whether it worked or not. But that's like the equivalent of us going to an Apple store, handing over the best part of $1,000, getting a box, opening up the box, and then only 50% of the time there's an actual phone in there. Like, you'd be furious, you'd be absolutely furious. But this is what we ask patients to do, and what we have asked them to do for the last century or so. And it's at complete odds to how services are being designed outside a clinical trial. So behind me is Google Venture, IDEO's got a similar one, but it's all about like that iterative design model, adapting to what you see and changing and being responsive. You might take a step forward, step back, but you're changing, and your ultimate goal is to get a service that works. But only recently is this thinking starting to creep into clinical trials, and it's called adaptive clinical trials. And it's the idea that you start the study, you have certain observation points, and then depending on what you see in those observation points, you change the design of that study. You might change the dosing or the sample size or even the mixture of drugs that you get. Because the ultimate goal of all of these studies is that every patient that gets to the end has got a solution that works for them. We stop wasting the time of people that are never going to improve. And probably the best example of this at the moment is adaptive clinical trials for cancer. So last year at the Switched Oncology event, Jess Mills spoke to us about this, Dr. Jack has spoken to us about this. And it makes perfect sense, but these guys have had to lobby governments, work tirelessly with healthcare organizations and charities and patient advocacy groups to try and get a designed model that makes complete sense through. And at the moment, it's still a rarity.
In terms of actually finding patients for trials, awareness is the first step, getting people to know that trials are even an option. But then if a patient wants to take part, they have to try and find what's the right trial for them, which are the ones that fits their criteria, and then how do they find out a bit more information about these new things, and how do they potentially sign up? The story that we shared with Carrie earlier, that wasn't a film that we put together specifically for this event. That was actually a telephone interview we did with a patient, recorded on my iPhone, that we edited afterwards, for a real trial we were looking at. For that trial, we actually wanted to explore what's the experience for a patient when they want to try and find out more information about a trial and potentially try to sign out. So we've actually got a recording of a series of telephone calls where we phoned up the pharmaceutical company's call center and we tried to find out some more information, and we tried to find out how to get onto that study. So we're going to play a little edit of that, which is a summary of what ended up being about 6 days and about 2 hours worth of conversations. And you'll hear Will from my team's voice quite a lot throughout this, as he was the person making the calls.
Thank you for calling Patient Assistance. May I have your name, please? Kane, are you the patient?
I was just calling because I saw a clinical trial on your website, and I wanted a bit more information on how to, if I had a family member who wanted to get involved.
With getting assistance from us?
No, it's just to sign up to the study or to get more information.
Okay, give me one moment. Are you there?
Hi, yes.
Okay, and you said, what did the website thing say?
The website is clinicaltrials.gov, and it just gives information about a study that you've got open, and I was just wondering how you sign up to the study.
How do we, okay, so it's a clinical trial, and you said you wanted to know how to sign up for the study?
Yeah, for the trial. How do you?
We don't do studies.
Okay, the
We
clinical.
just provide medication with people, to patients.
Okay, so you don't have anything to do with the clinical trials.
No. Don't have
Okay.
anything to do with the clinical trials at all, no.
Yes, it's kind of funny when you're doing it as an exercise to test a process, but it's not that funny if you imagine a patient desperate to get health gain through that process. This was, as I say, this was a condensed journey of someone who was very knowledgeable, trying to make their way through a system. Most of the patients are just trying to find out a bit of information about how these things work so they can then maybe consider if it's something for them. And the way that the system is designed really is to try and filter you out, not to try and guide you on a process to the information you need. This, unfortunately, isn't just a one-off example that we managed to pick just for this kind of purpose, to make a point. We've done the same exercise for a number of top pharma companies, for a number of their top molecules, and gone through a similar experience for many of them. We had one only yesterday where it was a 14-day wait to get the first call back to then begin this process. And these are companies that have pipelines worth billions and billions of dollars, where the patients getting onto these trials is the kind of last step to unlock them for them. There's kind of some huge kind of systematic problems you can kind of see. And it starts to make those numbers that we looked at the start not seem so surprising. When you actually imagine that people aren't even picking up the phone when there could be patients desperate to take part. Completely different example now of how a study has found patients. This was a game that you may be familiar with called Sea Hero Quest. It was a collaboration between UCL, Alzheimer's Research, and a game company. And it was originally created to look at generating some baseline data around Alzheimer's. So they created a game, and the logic of how you played the game was designed to show whether someone had Alzheimer's or whether they were a person that wasn't affected. And it worked really well, and they generated millions and millions of hours worth of data through people playing the game. And they retrospectively found out that was a brilliant data source to actually be used to find patients for clinical studies. And they actually were able to use people that signed up to the game, identify them and get in touch to see if they'd be interested. But also the game itself was able to be used as a screening mechanic. In Alzheimer's, the way to identify a patient tends to be a PET scan, which is about $20,000 a time. I think for many of the trials, about the failure rate of those was about 90%. There's a huge amount of cost just to get people in and to see if they may be eligible or not. They're actually able to use this game to drastically improve the performance of the actual screening appointments, which I guess is a world away from just picking up the phone to someone who wants to take part.
So then the next stage is consent. And as Mark said earlier, this is an absolutely critical stage because this is where the patient signs up to it, they understand what they're doing, what it's going to look like, what to expect, but also any side effects that they might come across. And it's important not just because we want people to know what they're signing up for, but it's also really important for retention so that there's nothing that takes place in the trial that they weren't expecting, which causes them to drop out. Now, the problem with consent is that this is what the document looks like. It's 19 pages of incredibly complex language, of incredibly dense content that we're asking people to read and agree to. So most of the time, patients are either misreading it, misunderstanding it, or just not reading it at all. Now, of course, we're not the only industry in the world which needs to talk about really important legal information or safety information, but other industries have found really simple ways of taking this quite dense information and creating it in a much more compelling and engaging way. So the best example I've seen of this is the British Airways pre-flight safety videos. So these guys have taken what is normally quite a dull piece of information and made it really engaging. Now, I fly quite a lot, and I've seen that film dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and I still find it quite engaging. But it just goes to show that it doesn't need to take a lot of complex stuff to take information and make it a little bit simpler and a bit more engaging.
And when we actually get people onto the trial, we then need to keep them on it for sometimes 2-3 years, going through a whole load of complex procedures. In terms of retention, we can't underestimate. There's lots of quite serious medical reasons that people drop off of trials. Sometimes it's adverse events, sometimes it's they may discover they're on placebo, not want to take part, or other kind of serious reasons with the trial itself. But there's also lots of softer reasons that people drop out. Sometimes it's the inconvenience of the appointments, making 3 appointments a week where they have to travel 100 miles just may not fit around people's lives in the long term. They may have complicated data entry they need to manage as part of the trial. And for some people, just the cost of actually getting to appointments, if they have to travel 50 to 100 miles, and although they may even get the costs reimbursed for them, the process it takes to get the money back, they'd have to effectively fund so much money to get themselves to their appointments. Just from a financial point of view, many people drop off, certainly in the States. If we look at a consumer brand, Tesla had an issue in terms of the distance for a lot of their customers to get to a garage to actually get help if they had a problem with their cars. In the States, they've introduced these mobile garages that are actually able to come out to customers and solve a lot of the problems for them outside their house. This was actually an image from someone who tweeted at Tesla. He said he tweeted them, and within 40 minutes, he had a mobile garage outside his house, replacing his tire and fixing a few other issues. So Tesla have really taken what could have been a real negative and turned it into a huge positive that their customers are talking about. If we look at an example with a trial, there was an Alzheimer's study in the US, and they were really concerned about the burden on patients in terms of remembering their appointments, in terms of arranging travel and the payments around the actual transport itself. So they actually partnered with Lyft, which is a rideshare company in the States, similar to Uber, if you don't know them. And they provided pre-booked journeys for all of the appointments. So you had a car coming up when you needed to go to your appointment, it took you there, and all of the costs and everything were managed by the sponsor themselves. It's a kind of simple solution to solve some of those practical issues that are there within the trials.
And then finally, you get beyond the trial. So this is the point where a patient has invested months, if not years, of their life into the clinical trial. It's finished, and then suddenly, nothing. They're ghosted, right? There's no information about when the trial's going to read out, where it's going to read out, whether it was successful or not, just nothing. And this is upsetting on a couple of levels, right? Because first of all, it's just not particularly polite. It's not good manners. But secondly, this is a group of people who have shown you that they're incredibly interested in clinical trials, that they're willing to take part. Now, as a pharma company, you've probably got a pipeline. You've probably got a number of other clinical trials that you're going to want to do down the line. And this is a group of people that we could re-engage and form a relationship with. And when you compare that to what people like Starbucks do, who bend over backwards to make sure that post the point of purchase, they still manage to retain that relationship with the customer. So simple things like sending an email on their birthday or giving them exclusive offers or streamlining that experience. All of these really simple things that brands like Starbucks do without blinking an eye, we can take, we can adapt, and we can drop into the clinical trial setting and completely revolutionize the way that we update patients post the clinical trial.
So yeah, just to summarize, we've looked at a few small little examples of some of the challenges and some of the potential solutions to look at improving that patient experience. If you get a chance, hopefully, to read the white paper, you've seen we've delved into these in a lot more detail and looked at a number of other examples. So hopefully you'll get a chance to go through those. Just to summarize, really, in terms of, just to recap, there's over 300,000 trials that are happening this year around the world. And if just one or two of those trials can start to take on board some of these approaches and start to think about the patient experience throughout, hopefully we can start to correct some of those numbers that we kind of looked at the start.
Thank you.
Thank you.